You are listening to the Visualizing War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places. And we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies.
Hello, my name is Alice Koenig.
And my name is Nicholas Vierter.
And we co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. This episode is part of a mini-series looking at the ways in which people game war, whether online or in person, and how gaming or reenactment can challenge as well as reinforcing entrenched habits of visualizing conflict. Our guest is Dr Katarina Birkedal, previously a postdoctoral research assistant on our project and an expert on cosplay, the act of dressing up as characters from well-known films or popular culture. We're going to be asking Katarina how cosplay works, both as a form of entertainment and as a medium for exploring and empathizing with different viewpoints, and how cosplay can resist as well as perpetuate shared ideas and norms about conflict, how it both reflects but might also adjust habits of visualizing war. Katarina, you've hosted a couple of Visualizing War podcast episodes yourself, but it's great to welcome you as a guest today. Thank you very much for making time to talk to us.
And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's weird and wonderful to be on this side of the equation.
So Katarina, you love stories. This is something that you drew attention to at the start of your PhD thesis when you wrote how we make sense of the world, of ourselves, others, and our places in it is based in storytelling. So I wonder if we can start by asking you about the stories that you think most shaped you as you grew up and perhaps piqued your interest in studying storytelling as a form of world building.
Yeah, sure. The interesting thing, I think, for me is because, of course, there are stories in the sense that you open a book and that's a story that's very kind of open about what it is. It's a piece of fiction. But then you also have stories that are a little bit more deceptive because they're stories in the sense that, you're being told a narrative. And I want to also be clear that storytelling for me is not something that should be confused with saying that is false or fictional or that it's not important, but rather as emphasizing the way that we use language and construct a narrative to inform others of something that has happened. And so for me, I was both shaped by these stories that were very clear about what they were. So I think the first one that really made me go, ooh, when I was reading a book was probably Harry Potter, like many others of my generation. Reading those stories was opening my mind to a world in which staying together and fighting the authorities was revolutionary good, and that was really important, I think, and sort of sticking up for those who can stick up for themselves. Then when I was a little bit older, I opened The Lord of the Rings for the first time. I think I was 10 or 11, and we were doing a school project, and we were meant to read one book, like a children's book, and I was a terrible, pretentious overachiever, so I walked in with this massive stack of Tolkien. That for me became such an important part of the rest of my childhood, and now as well. Some of the same themes of coming together, and that you don't have to be powerful, you don't have to be a great authority to make a change. Change happens when you stick by your friends, when you stand up for those who, for whatever reason, can't stand up for themselves. You kind of give them your platform, you give them your voice. And then later on, other stories that are very transparent about what they were. So I was 15, I think, the first time I logged into the game World of Warcraft. That was a very different world. It doesn't have the same politics as Tolkien or as Harry Potter. This is a world you go in and you fight baddies, and that feels good. And everything is kind of solved by violence. But that was eye-opening in and of itself to see that twist on things. Like you go in certain quests and you're an environmental champion, you're sort of rooting out the disease in the wildlife, and you do that by killing bears. Like there's something there that doesn't quite make sense, but it's in the wilder politics of you solve complex issues by going in militarily. Suddenly, yeah, that does make sense, that's what we're being conditioned to think. Later on again, Marvel, and that is obviously a very multitudinous world with lots and lots of different kinds of stories and also different kinds of politics within that. In terms of stories that are not open about what they were, for me, the war story that was so foundational was the story about Norway and World War II. And the way that was told and taught to me in hindsight is very weird because the role of this very tiny country was blown out of all proportion to the point where I, into an embarrassingly old age, still very much a young child, but older than I would like, was shocked to learn that it wasn't about Norway at all, because all I ever heard was how we never surrendered, how we denied the Nazis the heavy water so they couldn't make their own nuclear weapons, how we sank Blücher, which nobody else has ever heard of ever, because it's not a big deal. And I remember being so shocked. I must have been 5, and my grandparents had visited Germany, and they'd brought me home like this really wonderful bathrobe. And I was like, wow, they let you visit? They're not really mad at us? And they were like, why would they be mad at us? It's absolutely ridiculous, but it was such a very clear narrative of we were the goodies and we never surrendered, and they were the baddies and we beat them, and the rest of the world came to our aid. I think that it goes to show the power of the way you tell the story can really impact how you view the players and the stakes. Because, of course, Norway was a very minuscule part of the atrocities that were being perpetrated. And those I didn't learn about until I was considerably older. And that, of course, changed my mind about a lot of things about the war, or informed me better, but it also changed the way I viewed history and made me think, okay, who's actually telling me this story? That kind of made me view those kinds of stories in the same way that I view stories that, I crack open a book or I plug in my computer to experience.
From stories generally, we've already moved right into sort of the field that we are so interested in, which is war and battle stories, visualizing war. So looking back, and obviously a lot of the stories that you looked at as a child, Tolkien, World War II stories, World of Warcraft, the Marvel films, they all have a lot of visualizations of battle in there. So looking back at those, what do you think, are there any habits of visualizing war that you notice in these stories that you think were foundational for you, and that, I mean, obviously might have been foundational also for other people who read and kind of immersed themselves in the same stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one which took me quite a long time to get rid of is this kind of facile linking between war and battle, that the war kind of takes place through the battlefield. And that's kind of the long and short of it. And you have a little bit of preparation, but it's all gearing up for that battle. And it doesn't pay any mind to people who are not involved in that battle in whatever way. So whether they be civilians, whether they be injured people, whether they be people who take on supporting roles who are not actively fighting. So people who are at camp, cooking, cleaning, nurses, medics, and also sex workers, which is something that I did not think of until very much later, but it's very interesting. It was the arms race and then the meeting in the battle, and then the battle kind of resolves things, and it doesn't look at things after that either. Really, you win the battle and then you've won the war and everything's amazing. Reconciliation, restitution, all of these really complicated, hugely important aspects of conflict, and that should be, I think, key in how we think about it, because these are traumas that are lifelong and longer than one person's life. They don't figure in the way that at least I was taught by these stories to think about war, because once the battle is won, then that's kind of it. It kind of boils down to the way violence kind of equals agency.
I think that's something that came up also in some of the other podcasts that we've recorded. And that's a topic that we're also very interested in. For me as a German, one topic that's close to that is the aftermath of the First World War, where, the way it's taught, it's that the Versailles Treaty ends the First World War. But obviously, as far as the kind of the mental engagement, the emotional engagement with this war concerns in Germany, this continues, and that leads to the Second World War, right? So there's a lot of rethinking to be done, I think, around these question of where wars begin and where they end.
Absolutely. I think that's probably one of the clearest and best examples that we have of the way in which the mishandling of the aftermath of battles prepare the ground for the continuous cycle of violence, more to the point, maybe actually make sure that the end of the battle doesn't mean the end of the violence at all.
Yeah, it's something definitely that lots of our podcast guests are bringing up, and the way in which so many stories don't narrate what happens beyond battle, as you've been saying, but that bit is even more important in many respects, that conflict transformation, that conflict resolution, and then sustainable peace building is not a popular topic in Marvel films, or indeed in ancient epic poems, for example, thinking back to the Iliad or to the Aeneid, they end with the death of the heroes, but there's nothing that sort of looks beyond that. And as you say, that sort of sense of multi-generational trauma and multi-generational ripples is something that is almost beyond the scope of many narratives to contemplate. Katarina, you mentioned your experience of being taught about World War II in Norway. You've obviously also spent a lot of time in the UK. So I wonder, just sort of thinking about contemporary popular culture in both places, the UK and Norway, if you can tell us a little bit about how militarized you think popular culture in both countries is, in the stories, the films, the superhero franchises, the popular games and so on. How militarized is that? How prominent are martial themes or martial discourses in Norwegian and British popular culture?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, is the kind of massively popular culture is the same and frequently American, US American. You have a lot more British popular culture as well coming into Norway than you have the other way around. You have maybe two exceptions and that's it. So in terms of looking at the hugely popular stories and media, not very much different. I think the way that these things are being taught in school and the way that they are handled in the everyday and on big national occasions, I think that's a more interesting difference. So, for example, the way that the UK does the memorial habit just doesn't exist in Norway. We don't have memorial. The closest we have to that is around kind of April, May, especially if it's a round year, ending with a 5 or a 0. People will maybe talk a little bit more about the resistance during World War II than usual. And if it's a big number and ends with a 5, so in 2005, for example, it was 100 years since Norway gained its independence, or if it ends in 14, so 2014 was 200 years since the constitution, there will be a little bit more talk about that period in time. But the mythos that Norway has built for itself is that we are an inherently peaceful democratic people. And so war is kind of the great big other that only figures as a kind of challenge for us to overcome and show that, our inherently peaceful, freedom fighting, equal ways will win through. And so all of our stories, to take that example of World War II, how we never surrendered, we didn't give in to the tyranny. Those are really important to our sense of selves and the way that we build ourselves up as a kind of peacemaking nation. There was obviously in the early 90s, the Oslo peace talks between Israel and Palestine that, of course, we now know were not really what they seemed to be, because the people from the Norwegian side of things were taking directions from Israel. But that was one thing I grew up with, that, we made peace between Israel and Palestine, which we didn't in any way, in any sense of the word. And that since World War II, we haven't done anything, which again is not true. But the narrative is so strong that every military action we take is figured within that world of peacemaking. So we were in Afghanistan to make peace. We were bombing Libya to make peace. And historical battles that we took part of in a pretty major way, like the Northern Wars, for example, are not mentioned at all. I was in my late 20s when I learned that they'd occurred and that a Swedish king had died on Norwegian ground not very long ago in battle. And of course, in the UK, that's not the case at all. Everybody knows of all the great battles and all the great wars that the UK took part in. And these are celebrated. And of course, they're celebrated in the sense that we're meant to think about how sad they are and how terrible it was that they took place. But it's also a celebration of the loss, in a sense. At least that's kind of how it feels going into it, that it's a terrible loss that you're kind of glad to have. And of course, the wearing of the poppy is a very obvious kind of in-your-face reiteration of that military history. Mm-hmm. That is just completely suppressed here. It's ostensibly oppressed because we have a really rather good drill corps that perform drills and stuff, and they perform at random events, which is, I think, most obviously kind of military show that we have, like that military tattoo.
Really interesting to hear you talking about the exposure that you get growing up in Norway to peace narratives, but that sits alongside these monocultural habits of visualizing war that come with these sort of superhero franchises that, as you say, are sort of mostly American culture.
It is interesting because there's a way that these two aspects, they do not compute. And so there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that's going on there, but it's not really dealt with because our sense of self is so closely tied up to that. And so it's an example, I think, of how something like a peace narrative, which is potentially very positive. I know you've spoken to Frank Muller about this as well, and that, these peace narratives can be used constructively, but they have to be used reflectively. Otherwise, it's just going to gloss over a whole heap of things you'd rather not think about, but that you need to think about. Otherwise, you're just going to keep reiterating the same cycle of violence.
Katarina, just slightly changing the topic. We said at the beginning that one of the things that you are very interested in, one of the things that you're also academically an expert in, is cosplay, which is a form of engagement with popular culture, with stories. And I'm just wondering, does cosplay come into this at all? And the question of how we process war or peace narratives? And maybe you could tell us a bit more about what cosplay is and how it is linked to this other interest of yours, which is war and peace narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. Cosplay, very briefly, is the act of wearing, usually also making. Certainly people also do buy ready-made costumes, or they buy costumes which they then modify. But the wearing of the costume of a particular character from some form of media. Very typical example is to dress up like Spider-Man. So you wear the costume, you make the Spidey poses, and you've kind of become Spider-Man. So that's the very short of it. One of the really interesting things about cosplay is the way that process works, that you start out looking into the mirror and you see yourself, and then you gradually put on the makeup, you put on the wig, or you do your hair, and you put on your costume, and you can gradually see yourself becoming someone else until you, at the end, your body changes. Myself in cosplay, I've gotten a lot of comments like, the moment you had that costume on, like you weren't walking like Katarina anymore, you were walking like the character, and the voice changes and all of these things. So it's a way of becoming, in the sense of temporarily being someone else as well as yourself. And in that sense, it can be really powerful in being a sort of teaching moment of empathy. Like, this is the way it feels to walk in those shoes, at least as far as I can tell, because of course you can never completely be the other, but you can kind of become in that moment. One of the other interesting things about cosplay is the way in which you can argue that everything is cosplay. For example, wearing a military uniform is a form of cosplay. So you put on that uniform, maybe you shave your head, maybe you remove makeup, or maybe you put on war paint. That's also something that people do. And your gait changes because you've got these heavy boots. Your posture changes because you're now in the military and you're rank and file. The way you carry yourself on public transport, for example, changes because people are looking at you and they're not seeing you, they're seeing the uniform. And so you have become the uniform, you have become the physical embodiment of your military. Likewise, something like a national costume can be interpreted as a form of cosplay, not of a particular character, but of sense of the symbolicism that is tied into the nation. And so, for example, here in Norway, we have bunads, which are sewn differently according to the different regions, and often differently even within the region, with different kinds of embroidery, and it's all sewn up into a historical silhouette, and you put it on and people can tell at a glance where you're from, and then make assumptions of you based on that you then respond to, because of course the way that you are hailed on the street determines the way that you respond and the way that you feel about yourself. The obvious comparison in Scotland is tartan, different tartan, and wearing a full kilt.
So essentially, there's an implication in cosplay in the way in which it makes us think about societal processes more generally, including how people become parts of what I would call these discourses, right? It's not just taking on certain ideas, taking those on board, appropriating them, but there's the whole kind of material aspect to it, by which, putting on a uniform is not just an expression of something, it's also a performative process in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a dual sense to that, in which one is your perception of the character. So from your observations, how they act, and your kind of conscious and unconscious performance of that, as well as, of course, other people's perception of the character that determines how they respond. So, for example, if I'm walking around in the costume of a character from World of Warcraft and someone recognizes that character, they have no reason to address me as Katarina because they don't know me, but they know that character. And so they will respond to me depending on how they feel about that character. But then also, as you were saying, the very physical, material feeling of wearing those costumes, which are often incredibly uncomfortable. So you kind of feels restrictive, but also empowering. because usually you've chosen that character because something resonated either with who you are or who you want to be, or some form of your personality that you feel uncomfortable with expressing on the day-to-day basis. But if you're wearing that costume, it's expected and it's therefore okay, and you can feel what it's like to act in that way.
So cosplay allows stories to break into reality and reality to kind of cross the boundary into stories a little bit. You've talked about individuals putting on costume and becoming characters, but as I understand it, cosplay is also something that people do collectively. So can you tell us a little bit more about, how far down the road of playing out your character's story, or indeed experimenting with that story, might a typical cosplayer go?
Absolutely, yeah. So at least pre-pandemic, presumably post-pandemic, most cosplay takes place at these conventions. So Comic-Con, fan expos, Gamescom, which are these frequently huge gatherings. You get big franchises who come and show off their newest whatever. You have people selling merchandise, you have meet and greets, you have Q&As, and you have people wearing cosplay. Imagine like a convention hotel, but because these characters are walking around and there are people who recognize these characters and the characters recognize each other, it becomes a kind of simulacrous space. It's a facsimile of a story that you've then copied and that is then taking place in this space that doesn't quite make sense. Say if I'm walking around as Loki, who's a character from Marvel as well as Norse mythology, and someone knows me, they'll say, "Hey, Loki," and I will respond as Loki. It's not the most earth-shattering, sort of fantastical, theatrical thing, but it's a small kind of recognition of I'm not me in this moment, I am Loki. And then, of course, if I, as Loki, meet Thor, then that is a very clearly established base of communications. So we both know exactly how to respond to each other, and we do pretty much automatically. If there are larger groups, then they will also respond like that until someone breaks it and asks, what are you getting for lunch? It's very tenuous because anyone could break the illusion at any point, and it does happen. And it doesn't take more than anyone being like, who are you meant to be? For you to be like, having to establish it, and then that the magic is failing. But more often than not, it remains, and it feels empowering because you've made this effort to put on someone else and it's being recognized.
Kind of creates communicative and behavioral infrastructures in which you can sort of slot in and then work with that.
Exactly.
Katarina, you mentioned Loki. What about other characters? Which characters do you tend to go for? And obviously, I suppose we're all interested also to know whether your interest in warfare has anything to do with your choices.
Yes. I'll very briefly backtrack and say that the reason why I thought of cosplay in the first place was because I was interested in these narratives of war and violence in popular culture. And like, how does being so enmeshed in that culture affect you as an individual, as a person? And I knew I wanted to go to these conventions because that's the easiest way to get access to a whole lot of people really fast. But I also knew that if I came as an outsider, because there's a lot of prejudice against people playing games, and especially adults playing games and reading comic books and being interested in stories, like that's seen as a childish thing. So if I came in wearing my big academic hat, dressed in an academic way, then people would probably not respond very well. They might be suspicious. It might take me a good long while to get any response. So I thought, well, the easiest way for me to do any of this is to do my own cosplay. And I thought it would just be like a helpful device to essentially gain people's trust enough that I could sort of say, this is what I'm doing. Are you interested in talking to me? I chose a character because I was also interested in seeing how people would react to me as that character. So I'm generally female shaped, and this is a character who on screen is usually male shaped, but is gender fluid. And that's Loki. And Loki is also usually figured as a villain. And so figures within the kind of stories that we tell in the superhero world about conflict as, the breaker of status quo, the hyper violent, also hyper like effeminate character. And I wanted to see, okay, if I put that on, how will people react to me? And I didn't anticipate the most interesting thing would be, how would I react to that? Which was with a sense of, wow, this is completely different. Like, this feels so physically and emotionally powerful and different that I have to take this into consideration. The second character was Black Widow, who I chose because she's within the same universe, but she's hyper feminine. And that hyper femininity is part of her violence, essentially. So she uses her perceived vulnerability and the way that the baddies in the tale hypersexualize her to essentially trap them in her web so that she can take them out. And it's a very stereotypically feminine superhero silhouette, like skin tight bodysuit with leather, like the zip is down to the cleavage. The hair is long and flowing, not up. And I was like, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see how people will react to a female-shaped person who embraces that? And then the third character, Sylvanas Windrunner from World of Warcraft, I chose because the silhouette is even more feminized. Like she's wearing bra armor, and part of her armor is shaped like a little panty, and she shows a lot more skin. But also because that is a character who is usually figured to be not a hero in any sense, like at best an anti-hero. A lot of people figure her as a straight out villain. So the response to that character in that kind of outfit. And I went into this a little bit, thinking about Gamersgate and that kind of culture. And overwhelmingly, what I found was that people respond to the character, not the costume. And the second thing that I found was the empowerment that came with kind of embracing that hyper feminine role and using it rather than letting it be used against you.
So it sounds like initially you were interested in trying out a range of different kinds of characters, male, female, gender fluid, to see how other people respond to them. But you ended up discovering also things about how you responded to them and what it felt like to cosplay and to be these different people. Can you just explain Gamersgate to us, just for people who don't know?
Yeah, the gist of it was the way that female presenting people and people of color and queer people were being addressed by usually white cishet male gamers was revealed to be extremely negative, like repeated harassment. It kind of exploded. There was a lot of other things around it, and it was being explained away as a lot of other things as well, but that was kind of the takeaway, was resentment that was being revealed and then additionally unleashed against especially female presenting gamers in the community.
I wonder whether we can stay with one of the things that you were saying earlier, and that seems to me to unite all these characters that you were interested in, which is a link between gender and warfare and violence. And I wonder whether you could tell us a bit more about this and maybe even branch out a little bit and talk more generally about what dealing with these characters has taught you about the relationship between visualizations of violence and gender, but also sort of more generally, are there cliches in particular that these characters sort of propagate? Do they also kind of contribute something original to how we think about how we visualize war?
One of the interesting things about gender is, of course, it's completely something that we've made up, but a dichotomization of masculine and feminine influences a lot of how we view different things. And within that, I think about the kind of attributes and the virtues that we assign to masculinity and femininity. So, for example, masculinity, heroism, valor, the kind of authority, taking charge, leading the way and people following. Within that, the assertion that masculine violence is good protective violence, is a heroic kind of violence. And if it's not, if it's a masculine character perpetrating bad violence, then that violence is typically coded in a way that reads somehow effeminate. Because, of course, the feminine is meant to be the virtuous, the pure, the passive, the peaceful. And so when a feminine character perpetrates violence, it must be kind of explained away as somehow a perversion of that femininity. Either the denial of motherhood is a really common one, either infertility or the loss of a child. Hypersexualization is another one, because of course the masculine is sexually active and the feminine is sexually passive. And so if you have a female presenting character who is sexually active, then her violence can then be attributed to that perversion of her femininity.
Like the Black Widow.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, through the name, you also have the link with an animal.
Yeah.
The animal kingdom, right? So it's almost like it's something that's animalesque and not quite right in a way.
Yeah, it's stripped of humanity and the complexity that comes with being human into something that's seemingly very base or simple.
These ideas obviously go back a very long way. You know, we see this intersection between discourses of gender and discourses of violence and war in the ancient world too, and the creation of monstrous women in narratives because they take on leadership roles or are violent or sexually active and so on. But it's really interesting to hear you talking about the way in which 21st century popular culture is reinforcing some of these discourses, these habits of visualizing genders and which intersect with habits of visualizing war. Can you tell us a little bit more about Loki? You said is a gender fluid character and not a typical hero, somewhat villainous, somewhat heroic. What did you learn about Loki, but also about these sort of discourses of war, these discourses of heroism and discourses of gender from cosplaying Loki?
I mean, one of the really interesting things about Loki is the fact that as a character, they go way back because, of course, it's originally a character from Norse mythology. It's worth also pointing out briefly the way that we view gender as a binary in the modern West is absolutely not universal. And it's something that we as a culture have kind of imposed upon a lot of other cultures. And is also not old necessarily. So I know that within some ancient Greek thinking, and as well as within ancient Norse thinking, the two gender module was not a thing. It was a one gender module with kind of differing points of weight on the scale. So depending on how you behaved, you kind of was a bit more to the one or the other. And Loki, all the way back then, was a character who very purposefully embodied the kind of extremes on both ends as well as the grey middle. And that's something that has been picked up as well now. So you have the way in which as a character, even though until very recently within the comic universe, Loki's been openly gender fluid a lot longer. But within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Loki started out as a fully male presenting character. But there were lots of clues that kind of pointed us in. So from the costuming, the way that Loki's costuming was a lot more mixed, a lot of types of fabric, was a lot more asymmetrical. In the first film, collars were like too large. And the way that Loki was filmed, like with an emphasis on the kind of delicacy of his hand movements in combat, as well as just particularly the way that the violence was spoken about in the film. So you have, by contrast, you have Thor, who is this super masculine character who embodies all of the masculine virtues, as well as in the beginning of the film, the kind of associated vice of being too violent. But Loki is spoken about as being a coward for using magic and his wits and deceit in conflict solution, and for trying to minimize casualties and conflict rather than rushing in and meeting the foe head to head, which is figured as the honorable thing to do, presumably because then you're given both sides a quote unquote fair chance. So you have a moment in the story where Loki is trying to fend off an imminent attack from an enemy planet and chooses to use essentially a weapon of mass destruction in order to save the lives of his charges, because at that point he is regent. And interestingly, given that this is an American story, and of course the Americans with a history of using nuclear weapons, but this is figured as an immense act of cowardly, excessive violence. But it's interesting the way that his violence is figured in that way, when Thor's violence, who previously in the film destroyed massive amounts of infrastructure and killed a whole lot of people on that same planet, was seen as bad, but in the end, like he's a good guy. And of course, at the end of the first film, Thor casts Loki down on the Rainbow Bridge and then breaks it, which I think is difficult not to read in a queered way. And then, of course, in later films, you have the same kind of story reinforced that Loki's violence is excessive, that it is extreme and unpalatable. So it's filmed in a more visceral way. And he is played up as a diva and filmed and portrayed in a way that emphasizes the way that his masculinity is lacking. It's a queer, feminine sort of masculinity, compared especially then to his foil Thor, who after the first film is only ever virtuous, is only ever worthy of all of his power, and all of the violence that he does is only ever good.
That sounds like the films perpetuate quite a lot of, let's say, fairly conservative, stereotyped ideas about violence, masculinity. With Loki, this duplicity goes deeper even, right? I mean, he's not the natural son, as one would say, so he doesn't represent the male lineage. Thor does. He comes from an enemy planet and has become part of this other society. So there's duplicity all the way through, not just in his sexuality and his use of violence, but also in his lineage, in his role in the society, and so on and so forth. All things considered, it sounds like there's a very conservative message underlying this figure. Is that right? Or
yeah, I think that's certainly the way it's portrayed in the films. But of course, then the interesting thing is the fact that the audience loves Loki and really embraces that character. And I think a lot of that has to do with feeling themselves portrayed in not as extreme a manner, but in a similar way, the pervasive cultural norms. And so the embrace of Loki becomes an embrace of that person's own queerness and that person's own kind of multiplicity against the norms and virtues that the story originally seemingly wants to convey.
And that's something cosplay, I suppose, particularly brings out when you engage so deeply in a character that you sort of walk in their shoes rather than just watch more passively. But it's very interesting to hear you talking about the way in which these films are sort of feeding us models of more or less acceptable violence, which are mapped clearly onto ideas of gender, ideas of inclusion or exclusion. Just turning to the Black Widow, obviously Black Widow started out as a comic, as did Loki in the Marvel Universe. Is there much continuity between the comic version and the film version? And I wonder if you can also say a bit about the fact that obviously Black Widow is more rooted in the real world, whereas Loki is much more fantasy. What difference does that make, the sort of semi-real politics in the background, to its representation of war and to our engagement with these discourses of violence?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Black Widow is that she started her life at the height of the Cold War. And she is now we call her a Russian spy turned quote unquote good. But then, of course, she represented the Soviet Union and she represents the Red Scare. And with that, she represents all the ways in which particularly Eastern European and Russian women were sexualized and seen as inherently dangerous and duplicitous. Of course, we can still pick up on a lot of the language that was used. Just the name Black Widow is something that we also recognize from actual real world politics, the Chechen Black Widows. But you also find the character of Black Widow kind of replicated in a lot of James Bond, for example, like Xenia Onatopp is a famous example. In terms of the difference between the film and the comics, is actually a very interesting choice to have this Black Widow not be super serum, super soldier. Like she's an ordinary woman with a lot of training. So she's not, as she was in the comics, born in the early 20th century and serumed up to be forever young. She is a normal aging person, just with a very traumatic background. And there's a very infamous part of the film Avengers Age of Ultron where she talks about her forced sterilization as part of what makes her monstrous, which again harkens back to what we were talking about earlier. What I find quite interesting about this is the way that it picks up on a lot of the anxieties that we have now towards Russia, and especially that are prevalent in the US against Russia. So you have in the Black Widow film, it turns out that the person who was responsible for her own brainwashing is still just picking up girls, the quote unquote most expendable natural resource on the planet, and brainwashing them chemically to facilitate his nebulous political power that is just spread all throughout the world. But of course, Black Widow turns spy for the US, and she becomes, in the films, increasingly a nurturing persona towards the other Avengers, for all that she still kind of in battle uses those same tricks. The turning of Black Widow from a very suspicious character who we don't trust to someone who we do trust is portrayed through her increasingly nurturing nature. And then, of course, in the end, a spoiler alert, she sacrifices herself.
You're touching again on something very fascinating that I particularly noticed looking into Black Widow and her representation more, this sort of very porous relationship between narrative and reality. So with Thor and Loki, we look back into the deep past, we're getting in touch with Norse mythology, really, really, really old stories. With Black Widow, her background starts in a much more recent past, but also her representation is incredibly futuristic. And there's AI and there's effectively cyber warfare. So it's a mix of kind of futures thinking and pure fantasy. So I think one question I'd like to ask is, how did the Black Widow films shape the ways in which we might imagine or visualize future war?
Interesting question. There's a difference, right, between the Avengers, which is a franchise in which she is a part. So that becomes kind of more of a question of what is the Avengers films teaching us about the future of conflict, which is, yes, the danger of AI, malignant AI. In the case of the two big films, Infinity War and Endgame, a very twisted, weird take on essentially overpopulation leading to extreme situations. In this case, because the baddie kills off half the universe because of overpopulation. But if we dial that back, then we can think about the future of conflict as a resource, which is not very innovative thinking. It's of course been a major concern for a long time, but it's perhaps still one of the more prescient predictions. Also in the sense that, of course, it's already taking place. But in terms of the Black Widow film on its own, teaches us, I think, something about the role of extreme immersion in one culture. Of course, in this case, it is at the control of one very sick man, massive spoiler alerts, who chemically brainwashes a whole bunch of young women into doing his bidding and then doses himself with pheromones so that they can't attack him. If we think about the ways in which a lot of internet culture is becoming cult-like, so you got things like QAnon, where people become essentially brainwashed into seeing these conspiracies, into seeing the world in a very particular way, where white cis-straight men are the victims of a conspiracy between women, between people of color, between queer people, to take away their power. And it's more difficult to quote unquote deprogram now because it's so immersive. The internet is everywhere. You can't just take them out of a physical location and then put them somewhere else. So it's perhaps an interesting conversation to have, to kind of liken what he was doing to all these Black Widows to what is happening with particularly young boys who go online and find the seemingly supportive space that is incredibly toxic.
So Katarina, we've talked about Loki, and we've talked about the Black Widow and how their portrayal kind of feeds into ways of visualizing war and kind of bigger themes and topics that are linked to representation, war and battle. What about the third character that you mentioned, Sylvanas Windrunner? Can you tell us a little bit more about her as well?
Absolutely. So Sylvanas Windrunner is a character from the game World of Warcraft, which is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which is to say that it's an open world game with a lot of players simultaneously in the same place, playing a continuously evolving story. And she is a character who has been around from the beginning, and she was a general who was then turned into an undead creature and used against her will until she broke free and then became the leader of other undead people like herself who had broken free from this entity that had turned them undead. And she's a very interesting character, very complex, with motivations that have been the subject of a lot of questioning and a lot of scrutiny for a very long time. And people tend to be very polarized. They either hate her or love her. There used to be, I'm sure there still are some places, people, saying Sylvanas is my queen, IRL. But she is a character who is at once, in her costume and particularly in the early days of the game, hypersexualized. Like her earliest costumes were a bra and some pants, some thigh-high boots, a bare midriff, and some huge pauldrons, and a bow and arrow and a cape, and that was it. Completely bare midriff, completely exposed chest, completely exposed inner thighs. So all the places that you really want to hit someone if you're in combat were completely exposed, because that's quote unquote sexy. But at the same time, she goes counter to a lot of those feminine virtues that we were talking about earlier. So she is explicitly not at all a nurturing person. She refers to the soldiers working under her when she was a general as arrows in her quiver. And she later refers to her people for whom she's responsible in the same way. And although she takes her charge seriously, she is completely unfazed by sacrificing huge swathes of her own people if they are either expendable or if they do something counter to what she perceives to be the best way to go about things. And so if we relate that to the quote unquote real world, I think it's interesting to think about her in the post 9/11 US context. The game World of Warcraft came out in 2004. Because the Warcraft games came out earlier than that and stretched back into the 90s, but World of Warcraft came out in 2004. And so she embodies a lot of those very othered characteristics that we saw ascribed to the enemy, quote unquote, of kind of being this many-headed snake that you'd cut off a head, 3 others would take, and it was just chaos. A finger in every game, so they were everywhere. Inherently violent and warmongering, fond of destruction, and completely willing to use weapons of mass destruction. Sylvanas is a big fan of chemical warfare, and at the same time, deeply agential. So when she wants something to happen, it happens. In the same way that it was spoken about in the news at the time, that a new attack could happen at any point. It was a constant state of danger because the ball was in their court, and quote unquote the West was just playing catch up. At the same time, very effeminate because of all the ways that these masculine virtues, which also include rationality and a violence that doesn't seem excessive and so can be seen as restrained, the perversion of all of these. Like, she's not concerned with honor or glory or anything like that. She is concerned with getting the job done that needs to be done. And sentiment is not a thing that she concerns herself with, and she views as a complete weakness.
And I suppose chasing honor and glory are very masculine virtues, and they have been since the ancient world, haven't they? So Sylvanas Windrunner sort of embodies all the things that in the early 2000s and onwards, we've been afraid of in many ways in conflict. And what we've been picking up from the conversation, Katarina, is the ways in which many of these characters reinforce traditional discourses of gender as well as discourses of war, sometimes disrupting them as well, but often reinforcing them. But I think one of the things that you've explored and written about in terms of cosplay is the way in which cosplay allows for resistance and for questioning and for challenging, the way in which it's actually creative and disruptive, not just reproducing and reinforcing some of these norms and these habits of thinking. Is that right?
Yeah, I should preface, I guess, by saying that these are not necessarily the kinds of changes that will spark the Great Revolution. They're small scale, they're personal changes. But those are very important too, because without those, we don't learn to question anything. So the really interesting thing, I think, is the way that you put on that person. And you do that at first by intense research, by learning the person and learning how they look, how they walk, and all of the rest of that. But then you put that on, and you interact with other people as that person, and you kind of feel the ghosts, I guess, of their emotions, because of course, your underlying feelings of being a person in this world who's experiencing this are still there, are still present. Like you'll never lose those. But those kinds of ghosts of pride or shame or happiness or whatever it is you imagine that character feels are still there. So you learn essentially what it is like to move through the world as another person onto whom all of these narratives are ascribed, while sort of outwardly, by literally reproducing these characters, you are reproducing the narratives and the norms, and you're lending power to the franchises who produce these things, because they read it as popularity, as, yeah, we're doing the good thing, but you are putting it to purposes that might go counter to what they actually want you to take away. And sometimes that voice becomes so strong, the producers then have to take a step back and go like, okay, fans have spoken and we need to change this. And that feeling of temporarily becoming someone else, it never leaves. I can, after having walked around as Loki for so much, I can change the way I walk and talk like this. In so doing, people respond to me differently. I respond to the world differently. And I know that my own self and that other people are completely malleable, and that there's no such thing as a diametrically opposed self and other, that those are very nebulous, ever-changing and constructed categories. And I think that's a really powerful thing to learn, because it teaches in a very tangible and kind of extreme form empathy.
Something else that's come through also in what you've been saying about these characters is that obviously they are connected bigger topics like nuclear warfare, conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth that are important also in the world beyond those stories. And I suppose that's where your international relations part comes in. And part of your thesis in international relations actually discussed where studying a form of storytelling like cosplay might sit in within the wider field of IR, international relations. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple ways in which this is particularly useful. One of which is in learning to think critically about stories and what they do to us and what they tell us. It becomes easier to think about the narratives that are presented about what is happening in the quote unquote real world as well. So it's a kind of transferable skills moment. But there's also the point that these stories are very popular and influential. Like you see them referenced by other media, and they're also referenced by politicians, for example, and they're referenced by protesters and activists. And beyond that, the things that we encounter in our everyday are usually things that we don't necessarily think about, but that constitute the kind of shape of our world. And so if you go to the cinema and you see this story and then you go home and you watch the continuation of it on Disney Plus, and then you go down and you play a game in the evening, and then you go and you read a book. These are stories and attendant lessons that you carry on possibly throughout your life. And if we don't look at these critically, then we might miss the lessons that we are learning, and we might not question it. Just because they're everyday and they're mundane and they're not big important political games doesn't mean that they don't impact and shape the way we think about things and the way we talk about things. So in that sense, it's politics with a small p, but it's politics. And we need to question our politics, and we need to think about the consequences that our fantasies have on our reality.
And I think this goes to the heart of the Visualising War project, really, the interest that we have in the feedback loop between narrative and reality, and all these many, many different forms of storytelling, which really shape how we think and feel and behave. So all these discourses of war, which intersect, as we've been talking today, with discourses of gender and discourses of leadership and all sorts of other ideas. These have a profound influence on the decision-making and on the behaviours that we do individually, but also collectively.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there are a lot more intersections as well. Like these characters that I've spoken about are all in one way or another coded white. Although Black Widow is East European, she becomes, increasingly white American. And so talking about characters of color adds a whole other layer to the political intersection that is occurring in these stories. It's incredibly complicated. This is just a very small snapshot of a very big thing.
So lots more to think about, to talk about, and above all, also maybe a bit of an appeal to watch these captivating stories critically, be alert also to the stereotypes, to the patterns of thinking, the ideas that sort of underlie these very relatable characters. Can enhance sort of quite conservative agendas, but sometimes maybe, depending on what people make of it, can also become catalysts for more subversive ideas and activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I should also say that it depends a lot on the team who are making these stories. So you have, sticking to the Marvel side of things, you have different directors doing different things with the Disney Plus films. For 2017's Thor Ragnarok, you had Taika Waititi directing, who turned the story into an incredible commentary on the horrors of colonialism, using our Asgardian heroes as the perpetrators. It's possible to use a popular, quote unquote, vulgar medium to communicate subversive stories.
Katarina, that's all been really fascinating, and I've learned so much from this. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, and it's really great talking about these popular, very influential media in depth.
It's been really interesting, and it's really important. I was struck by something you said early on, which is that, when you as a child got into World of Warcraft, one of the things that you learnt was that everything's solved by violence and that even complex issues were addressed militarily. So that's one of the stereotypes, one of the sort of recurring narratives that these franchises perhaps perpetuate. But as Nicholas said, this sort of critical viewing and the power of directors as well, perhaps listening to their fan base to deconstruct some of that, all of that feeds into our evolving habits of visualizing war. So it's been really fascinating to delve into that with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you again very much, Katarina. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope that you found the conversation as interesting as we have. You can read more about cosplay as a way of interrogating and not just replaying the war stories that circulate in popular culture on our blog, where Katarina has written a really interesting think piece. She's written several, in fact, but this one is called Unsettled War Stories, Cosplay and the Potential of Resistant Reproduction. Please do tune in again next week when we'll be continuing our dive into popular culture and its impacts on our habits of visualizing war. We're going to be turning our attention from cosplay and reenactment to film production. And my guest will be Dr. David La Rocca, an expert on cinema and the author of books on the philosophy of war films, on parody and self-referentiality in cinema, and on film and TV documentaries. David will be talking us through a wide range of films that either focus on war or have war in the background, and we'll be thinking about what aspects of conflict they tend to depict. We'll talk a bit about why we watch war films, why they continue to be so popular, how the genre has evolved over the last century, and where the changing nature of war might take it next. And we'll also be discussing the impact which filmic representations of war can have on how we understand and approach conflict in real life. So do join us for that if you can. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show. And if you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zofia Gertin. Thank you again for listening.